Welcome to Slumber Darkly, where the unbelievable meets restful nights. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most perplexing cases of a sudden and unexplained death in a hotel room. A mystery that left both investigators and a grieving widow baffled for months. I think you'll find it impossible to guess the truth before we reveal it. But one thing is certain. This story will leave you uneasy as we venture into the unknown. So sit back, relax, and allow the mystery to unfold as you drift off to sleep. It was September 15th, 2010. A 55-year-old man named Greg Fleniken drove his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, to Beaumont, Texas, where his job required him to stay each work week. This 2-hour drive had become a part of his routine. Greg worked as a landman, a term used in the oil industry for someone who secures land leases and mineral rights for drilling companies. For Greg, it was just another Monday, just another trip, and just another week of work. Greg had spent years out at sea in his younger days, working as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels. Long stints away from home were nothing new to him, but as he reached middle age, Greg left that life behind and settled into a land-based job, one that still took him away from home, but allowed for more stability. His routine was simple, almost ritualistic. Drive to Beaumont on Monday, check into the Elegante Hotel, spend the week working, then drive back to Lafayette on Friday to be with his wife, Susie. The Elegante Hotel wasn't particularly special. Neither high-end nor low-budget. It was a mid-tier establishment with a basic room layout. A bed, a TV, a small window overlooking a modest pool. Greg didn't mind. He wasn't there for luxury. He was there for work. As long as he had a bed, a TV, and a space to unwind, he was content. When Greg entered room 348 that evening, he followed the same routine he did every Monday night. The moment he crossed the threshold, he dropped his bag at the foot of the queen-sized bed. The first thing he always did was hang up his shirts in the small closet, ensuring they wouldn't wrinkle during the week. He was meticulous about these small details. Then, he unzipped his toiletry bag, a cloth pouch with a hook, which he hung on the towel rack in the bathroom. With his shirts hung and toiletries neatly in place, Greg took off his worn brown boots and faded blue jeans, exchanging them for comfortable pajama pants. He had no plans to leave the room that night. Although the hotel had a bar downstairs, Greg wasn't much of a drinker, nor was he a socializer. He preferred quiet nights alone, enjoying the simple pleasures of a cold room, a good movie, and a cigarette. Greg slipped into bed, cranking the air conditioning to its lowest setting. He loved sleeping in a cold room. In fact, the colder, the better. He stacked 2 large pillows behind him, leaning back against the headboard, and set up his essentials for the night. A towel laid out beside him on the bed, where he placed his ashtray, cigarettes, lighter, TV remote, phone, and a candy bar. It was Greg's version of comfort, his routine to unwind. He turned on the TV and flicked through the channels until he landed on Iron Man 2. It wasn't exactly his favorite movie, but it was good enough to pass the time. Greg opened his candy bar, took a bite, lit a cigarette, and settled in for the night. But this would be the last routine Greg would ever follow. The next morning, September 16th, was different. Greg always called his wife, Susie, first thing in the morning, every morning. It had been their routine for years, a small way to stay connected even when Greg was away for work. But this morning, the phone didn't ring. Susie waited, thinking maybe he was just running late, or perhaps his phone was dead. But as time passed, her concern grew. Susie tried calling him multiple times, but each call went straight to voicemail.
You've reached the voicemail of...
The more she dialed, the more uneasy she felt. Something wasn't right. Greg never missed their morning call, and this break in their routine sent a chill down her spine. She called his office in Beaumont, but Greg hadn't shown up to work. His coworkers hadn't seen or heard from him either. Susie knew something was terribly wrong. Growing more anxious, she asked Greg's coworkers to check on him at the hotel. Two of his colleagues, concerned for their friend, went to the Elegante Hotel and knocked on his door. Room 348 was silent. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. Fear gripping them, they went down to the front desk and asked the manager to unlock the door. When the door swung open, Greg's colleagues were met with a sight they weren't prepared for. There, lying face down on the carpet in the middle of the room, was Greg. His left arm was tucked awkwardly beneath him, and in his fingers was a cigarette, burnt down to the filter. The room was unbearably hot, and Greg's skin had taken on a strange, grayish-blue hue. The co-workers, shocked and terrified, immediately called 911. Detective Scott Apple arrived at the hotel shortly after the call came in. Detective Apple was a seasoned investigator, a short, fit man with silver hair, a cop through and through. When he entered room 348, he quickly surveyed the scene.
Calling all units.
No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no obvious wounds, and nothing appeared to be missing. Greg's wallet, still in the back pocket of his jeans, was untouched, with cash still inside. Greg's body lay in a position that suggested he had collapsed suddenly. A slight abrasion on his cheek indicated he had fallen face first onto the rug. His left hand still clutched the burnt-out cigarette. Aside from the heat in the room, which seemed out of character for a man who loved cold air, nothing was amiss. It looked like Greg had simply dropped dead. But the cause of death wasn't immediately clear. There was no blood, no visible signs of trauma beyond that small abrasion on his face. Detective Apple found no drugs, no alcohol, no prescription medications in the room. Everything seemed normal, except Greg's sudden death. The next step in the investigation was an autopsy. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, a veteran medical examiner in Beaumont. At first glance, Dr. Brown saw nothing to suggest foul play. Greg appeared to be a middle-aged man who may have died from a heart attack. Susie had even mentioned to Detective Apple that Greg wasn't exactly the picture of health. He had smoked like a chimney for decades and didn't eat well. A heart attack seemed plausible. But when Dr. Brown opened Greg's body, he found something that made no sense. Greg's internal organs were a mess. His ribs were broken, his internal organs were lacerated, and his torso was full of blood. The injuries were catastrophic, more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car accident or crushed by a heavy object. Yet, there were no external injuries to match the trauma inside his body. Dr. Brown was puzzled. How could someone suffer such intense internal injuries without any significant external wounds? He noted 2 small abrasions, one on Greg's cheek from where he fell, and another on his crotch, but neither seemed capable of explaining the level of internal damage. It was a medical mystery. After a thorough examination, Dr. Brown concluded that this was not a natural death. Greg had not suffered a heart attack. He had been the victim of severe trauma. It looked like homicide. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Greg's death remained unsolved. Susie was devastated. Not only had she lost her husband, but there were no answers as to what had happened to him. It made her grief even more unbearable. Greg had always been in control, careful even in his own way, despite his unhealthy habits. Now, Susie was left with nothing but questions, and a case that seemed to be going cold. Detective Scott Apple worked tirelessly, re-examining the crime scene, going over the autopsy report, and interviewing everyone he could find who had been at the hotel that night. But the more he dug, the fewer answers he found. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. Greg had no known enemies, no dark secrets. He was well liked by everyone who knew him. There was simply no motive, no clear reason why someone would want to harm him. Apple kept returning to the oddity of the warm room. Why had the air conditioning been turned off? This was out of character for Greg, who always kept his room as cold as possible. But even this strange detail led nowhere. Weeks passed, then months, and Apple was no closer to solving the case than he had been on the day he first arrived at the Elegante Hotel. Susie, however, refused to give up. She needed closure, and she decided to take matters into her own hands. After several months of frustration with the lack of progress, she hired a private investigator, a man named Ken Brennan. Ken Brennan was no ordinary investigator. A former Long Island police officer and DEA special agent, Brennan was known for solving complex, seemingly impossible cases. With his thick New York accent, muscular build, and sharp instincts, Brennan had a reputation for being relentless in his pursuit of the truth. When Susie first contacted him, She wasn't sure if he would even take her case. After all, Brennan was often featured on television and in high demand. But to her surprise, he agreed to help. He was intrigued by the mystery surrounding Greg's death and flew out to Lafayette, Louisiana, to meet Susie in person. Brennan asked Susie the hard questions. Did she suspect Greg had been involved in something shady? Was there a possibility he had a secret life she didn't know about? But after hearing her answers and assessing the situation, Brennan was convinced that Greg's death had nothing to do with a hidden scandal or affair. He was just a regular guy who had somehow met an extraordinary, tragic fate. After their meeting, Brennan traveled to Beaumont to meet with Detective Apple. Apple, who had been working the case for months, was willing to collaborate. He shared everything he had with Brennan, from the crime scene photos to the autopsy report, and all of his interview notes. That night, Brennan pored over the documents, studying the details meticulously. Something stood out to him, the same thing that had bothered Apple, but hadn't yet led to a breakthrough. The air conditioning. Why had Greg's room been so hot? Susie had mentioned that Greg always kept the room cold, so why wasn't the AC running when his body was found? The next day, Brennan and Apple visited room 348 together. They stood in the exact spot where Greg had last been alive, and Brennan started to piece the puzzle together. The air conditioning, he thought, was the key. As he inspected the room, Brennan asked Apple to pull the maintenance logs for the hotel on the night Greg died. The logs revealed something interesting. At around 8:30 p.m. on the night of Greg's death, the power in his room and the rooms surrounding it had gone out briefly due to a blown fuse. The outage had also knocked out the air conditioning, and when the power came back on, the AC hadn't reset. Greg's room, which had been cold all evening, slowly began to heat up as the night went on. But by the time it became noticeably warm, Greg was already dead. This was the first real clue. If the power had gone out at 8:30 p.m., Brennan reasoned, Greg must have died sometime after that, but before the room got hot enough for him to notice. Brennan estimated that Greg had likely died between 8:30 and 9 p.m. But how? The autopsy suggested Greg had suffered massive internal injuries, the kind you'd expect from a car crash or a heavy object crushing him. Yet, there were no external wounds to explain this. Then, Brennan had another realization. The cigarette. Greg was found with a cigarette in his left hand, but Susie had told Brennan that Greg only smoked with his right hand. This detail had been overlooked by everyone, but to Brennan, it was significant. Greg, a habitual smoker, had lit his cigarette with his right hand. So why was it in his left? Brennan hypothesized that something had startled Greg, causing him to jump up from the bed. In his panic, he switched the cigarette to his left hand so he could use his right hand to open the door. But whatever had caused him to panic also killed him before he could make it out of the room. But what had scared him What had caused such violent internal trauma without any external evidence? Brennan's mind kept returning to the mystery of the trauma. As he stood in the room, his eyes drifted to the wall near the door. There was some patchwork on the wall, and at first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a cosmetic repair, perhaps from where the door handle had hit the wall over time. But something about it caught Brennan's attention. He opened the door and noticed that the doorknob didn't line up with the patch. This repair wasn't from the door hitting the wall. It was something else. Brennan, now curious, went next door to room 349. This was the room where 2 electricians had been staying the night Greg died. As Brennan ran his hand along the wall, he felt something unusual. A small, almost imperceptible hole in the wall had been filled with toothpaste. Brennan knew immediately what it was: a bullet hole. The 2 electricians had been drinking and fooling around with a gun that night. At some point, the gun had gone off, and the bullet had passed through the wall into Greg's room. The bullet hit Greg as he lay in bed, striking him with enough force to cause massive internal damage. Greg, unaware of what had happened, had likely stood up, cigarette in hand, trying to make his way to the door for help. But the damage was too severe. He collapsed in the middle of the room and died within minutes. Brennan had solved the case. With this revelation, Brennan and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians from room 349. His name was Lance. At first, Lance repeated the same story he had told investigators months earlier, that he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual the night Greg died. But when Brennan confronted him with the evidence, the bullet hole, the trajectory, the autopsy results, Lance crumbled.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be helpful.
Lance confessed that he and his friend, Mueller, had been drinking heavily that night. Mueller had retrieved his pistol from his car, and the 2 men began fooling around with the weapon in their hotel room. At some point, Mueller dropped the gun and it discharged. The bullet passed through the wall and into Greg's room. Lance and Mueller froze. They listened, but they didn't hear any signs of distress from Greg's room. Believing they had dodged a bullet, literally, they covered the hole with toothpaste and left the hotel to continue drinking at a bar. By the time they returned, they heard Greg coughing in his room, but thought nothing of it. It wasn't until the next day, when they saw Greg's body being wheeled out of the hotel, that they realized the gravity of what had happened. But by then, they believed they had gotten away with it. They had overheard investigators discussing Greg's death as a possible heart attack, and they convinced themselves that his death had nothing to do with the stray bullet. It was just a tragic coincidence, or so they told themselves. In the end, Mueller, the electrician who had been responsible for the gun, was charged with manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the reckless act that had taken Greg's life. Lance, who had covered up the evidence and lied to police, was also held accountable for his role in the cover-up. Greg Fleniken's death was a tragic accident, a senseless loss caused by carelessness and alcohol-fueled irresponsibility. It was a case that could easily have remained unsolved, if not for the tenacity of a grieving widow and the determination of a private investigator who refused to accept the easy answers. And so ends the mystery of Greg Fleniken. His death was not the result of malice, but of reckless behavior. A reminder that sometimes the darkest stories come not from acts of evil, but from tragic moments of carelessness. Thank you for joining us on Slumber Darkly, where we explore true dark stories designed to ease you into the stillness of the night. If you found tonight's tale compelling, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Until next time, may the quiet of the night bring you peace.